Have you ever felt like there was something hidden behind the words, something unsaid, yet screaming between the lines? When we read Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, we're struck by a deep, structured, almost surgical knowledge about success, wealth, and purpose. But if you look closer, if you read with eyes seeking more than formulas, something begins to emerge, something hidden, something that isn't literally written but seems to beg for discovery. There's a key, an essence, that was kept out, not by accident but by design. A part of the knowledge Hill deliberately chose not to publish directly because, in his own words, most people weren't ready to hear the whole truth. This isn't just allegory or literary mystery. It's a fact subtly mentioned by Hill in several interviews, lectures, and letters that have survived time. Napoleon Hill said that truth, when discovered prematurely or without preparation, becomes dangerous to the weak of spirit. He believed there was a point where knowledge crossed beyond the rational and entered the realm of the spiritual, the invisible, the unexplainable. In his own words, some things can only be understood by those who have already awakened to the power of the mind as an extension of the cosmic life itself. In other words, there was a layer of reality, a layer of the book itself that would not reveal itself to just any reader. It had to be searched for, felt, lived. Hill left clues. Words like vibration, ether, infinite intelligence, and higher consciousness are not there by chance. They point to something deeper than simple repetition of positive affirmations. They point to an energetic and spiritual field that few dared speak of in that era. One of the most enigmatic passages in Think and Grow Rich appears right at the beginning, when he writes, "If you are ready to learn, you will discover the secret in this book. When and if you are ready, you will recognize it." He never says what the secret is, not once. And yet, he insists that it's there, implicitly. That choice is not accidental. Hill created a kind of intellectual initiation, like a master handing you a map without marking where the treasure lies. He knew that true seekers, those with burning desire, unwavering faith and persistence, would go beyond the surface and find the key not in the words, but in the space between them. Hill himself confided to close friends and students that certain ideas and practices were deliberately removed from the final version of the book at the request of his publishers. Why? To avoid controversy, to keep the content acceptable to the average reader of the 1930s. It was a time of post-crisis conservatism, religious censorship, and the rise of American pragmatism. Speaking openly about meditation, mental trances, spiritual visualizations, and contact with higher intelligences could have ruined his reputation, and the book's chances of becoming the classic it did. He had to encode these ideas in metaphor, and he trusted that the most sensitive readers would understand them, not with their eyes, but with their souls. There are accounts that Hill spoke of an invisible power that would manifest during hours of solitary inspiration. He believed this power was real, tangible, though not visible to the eye. In his words, "There is a living intelligence, a subtle presence, an energy that responds to disciplined thought. Those who know it never doubt again. Those who mock it never find it." That energy, according to him, was the true source of success. More than plans, goals, and connections, it was this silent, almost magical force that transformed thought into reality. And here we begin to understand the nature of the key that remained hidden. Hill gave us the map, but the X marks a place that is invisible. He didn't want readers to memorize laws. He wanted them to transform. That's why the book doesn't give everything directly. It demands participation, emotional commitment, unwavering faith, and spiritual sensitivity. This was the silent initiation Napoleon Hill offered, not with ceremony, but with pages filled with an invitation. Discover what isn't written. Feel what's being whispered between the words. Realize that the greatest secret was never spoken. It was felt. Imagine being a poor, unknown young man with no reputation to your name and being invited to speak with the richest man in the world, one of the most powerful magnates in the history of the United States. That's exactly what happened to Napoleon Hill. The year was 1908. Hill, then 25 years old, was assigned to interview Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King, for what was supposed to be a routine newspaper article. But that meeting was anything but ordinary. That moment, as later revealed by Hill himself, would change his life forever. What was meant to be a 3-hour interview turned into a 3-day conversation. And according to Hill, it was during that encounter that Carnegie shared one of the deepest and most dangerous secrets he had ever learned about success, power, and the human mind. Andrew Carnegie believed there was a formula for success, and that this formula was based not only on hard work, but on hidden principles of vibration, mental influence, autosuggestion, and alignment with universal laws. He didn't just speak to Hill about it, he challenged him. Without prior warning, he told Hill he would assign him a grand mission, one that would take over 20 years to complete, a secret mission. Carnegie proposed that Hill interview the most successful men and women of the era, Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, Alexander Graham Bell, Theodore Roosevelt, among others, to discover, compile, and decode the invisible principles these titans applied, often without even realizing it. But there was a condition. Hill had to do all of it without receiving a single paycheck. No promise of success, no contracts, just faith. And Hill said yes, but the most intriguing part lies between the lines of what Carnegie truly believed. In personal letters, Carnegie wrote that humanity's greatest achievements weren't born from logic, but from divine inspiration. He believed great ideas were transmitted to humans when they tuned into a high spiritual frequency. To Carnegie, geniuses weren't just talented, they were connected to something greater. The mission he gave Hill then wasn't merely practical, it was spiritual, mystical, almost a priesthood of success. And Hill understood that from the very beginning. In his memoirs, Hill recalls that Carnegie spoke of a concept that would change everything: the existence of an infinite intelligence, a universal mental field that permeated all things and all minds, a vibrational ether that responded to sincere human desire, but only when that desire was fueled by unshakable faith. Carnegie claimed that most people failed not due to lack of talent, but because they were disconnected from this source. And he added, "If you can translate this into words the world can understand without sounding insane, you will change the destiny of millions." That was the seed of the Think and Grow Rich project. Hill left that meeting with more than a mission. He left with a fire inside, a certainty that true success wasn't just about action and discipline, it was about alignment, about faith, about silence, about an invisible connection to something vast and magnificent. No wonder he writes with reverence about this concept in the pages of his book. Faith is the eternal elixir which gives life, power, and action to the impulse of thought. And it doesn't stop there. Hill also states that the ether, which permeates every space of the universe, is a substance that transmits thought vibrations just as it transmits sound and light waves. A language far ahead of its time, which today sounds like rudimentary quantum physics. If Carnegie had been just a businessman, all of this might sound like delusion. But he was, at the time, the richest man in the world, and he firmly believed in this invisible power. What few people know is that Carnegie also belonged to philosophical and esoteric societies, like the Theosophical Society, and had close contact with thinkers who spoke of energy, mental magnetism, and spiritual laws. He intuited that the human mind was more than a biological processor. It was a cosmic transmitter and receiver, and that's what he wanted to teach Hill, far from the public eye, far from the headlines, far from religious dogma. That meeting, shrouded in mystery, became the gateway that set Hill on a decades-long journey, interviewing over 500 influential people, enduring bankruptcies, persecution, loneliness, and even threats, all in the name of a message he knew couldn't be delivered explicitly. Carnegie gave him the mission, but embedded within it was a riddle, and Hill fulfilled it. But he left the secret code, hidden in gentle phrases, in metaphors, in chapters where the reader must feel more than understand. Because, as Carnegie and Hill knew, the rational mind grasps what is spoken, but it is the spiritual mind that deciphers what was left unsaid. In Think and Grow Rich, Napoleon Hill presents us with 16 fundamental principles for achieving success, from burning desire to persistence, from self-knowledge to teamwork. But what few people know is that in personal conversations, private lectures and letters discovered decades after his death, Hill consistently mentioned a 17th law, an unwritten, unpublished, unspoken law. A truth he claimed was reserved for those who are ready to listen with the spirit, not with the ears. This mysterious law was deliberately left out of the book for reasons he never explained directly. But the clues, scattered throughout his work and hidden speeches, lead us to believe this 17th law was the second supreme spiritual element, the force that unites, energizes, and transcends all other laws, the one that cannot be taught, only experienced. Napoleon Hill referred to this law by different names over the years. In some writings, he called it the law of vibration. In others, the law of spiritual energy. And in confidential lectures, he even referred to it as tuning into infinite intelligence. In his lesser-known work, You Can Work Your Own Miracles, 1952, he wrote, "There is a mental and spiritual force that responds to emotion, faith, and imagination with scientific precision. Those who tune into it transcend the limits of what is possible." Notice, he's speaking of an invisible field, a real energetic power that mirrors our inner state like a conscious reflection. This field, according to Hill, is the true secret behind miracles, sharp intuition, and the impossible coincidences that shape the lives of those bold enough to believe in the unseen. But if this 17th law was so powerful, why wasn't it published in 1937 along with the others? Hill never gave a clear answer, but he suggested that publishers and the public of the time weren't ready to accept the idea that success wasn't only mechanical or psychological, but profoundly spiritual. He said that the times demanded a science of success, not a mysticism of success. Yet behind these cautious justifications was another reason. He knew this law couldn't be understood through reading alone. It had to be lived. He feared that by exposing this raw and mystical truth, he'd be misunderstood, ridiculed, or even silenced. So he chose to encode it, leave clues, stack metaphors, like someone handing you a map but erasing the X that marks the treasure. In Outwitting the Devil, a book written in 1938 but only published in 2011 for being ahead of its time, Hill expands on this idea. He describes in detail his dialogue with a symbolic entity representing fear, distraction, and ignorance. And in this work it becomes clear that Hill didn't see reality as merely physical, but as a vibrational field, where the human mind is a creative instrument. The 17th law, then, would be the recognition that the universe responds to the vibrational state of our mind and spirit. When thoughts are charged with intense desire, absolute faith, and clear purpose, they cease to be mere ideas and become creative forces. That's when the invisible begins to move. But how do you apply this 17th law? Hill suggested subtle spiritual practices, often disguised as mental strategies. He spoke of intentional silence, the power of affirmations, emotional visualization, and prayer as vibrational tuning. In his words, When the human mind becomes a transmitting station of thought, tuned to infinite intelligence, it receives direct guidance, perfect ideas, and solutions that could never be conceived by reasoning alone. That sentence says it all. The 17th law is not a new step, but the hidden stage behind all the steps. It's the bridge between the rational and the spiritual, between desire and realization. It's the awareness that we are dealing with living forces, not just formulas. It's no coincidence that Hill also wrote, "Faith is the basis of all miracles and the only known antidote to failure." But he wasn't referring to blind faith. He meant active faith, vibrational faith, almost scientific, the kind of faith that moves the invisible. Faith that alters energy fields, attracts circumstances, connects people and ideas. That was the 17th law, the law of vibrational faith, of conscious connection with infinite intelligence, the law he taught only to his closest students, the law that turned ordinary seekers into conscious creators, the law he feared would be misunderstood, but which, deep down, was the true heart of his entire philosophy. Once we understand this law, everything Hill wrote takes on new light. We're not just reading a book about wealth. We're facing a sacred doctrine about reality creation. We're facing an initiation. And like every initiation, the final step isn't taken by the master. It's taken by the disciple. Hill gives us 16 keys. But the 17th he keeps in silence, because it cannot be given. It must be awakened within you. Napoleon Hill never hid the fact that he believed in invisible forces. But what many don't know is that for years he maintained a secret nightly ritual that, by the rational standards of the modern world, borders on the unacceptable. Hill revealed, without hesitation, that every night before going to sleep, he would enter a meditative state and gather, mentally, spiritually, symbolically, with what he called his Council of Immortals. A group made up of historical figures such as Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Edison, Charles Darwin, Andrew Carnegie, Socrates, Napoleon Bonaparte, and even Buddha. According to Hill, these individuals were invoked in his mind to advise, inspire, and guide him. For many, this might sound like fertile imagination, fantasy, or just a mental exercise. But to Hill, this process was real. So real that he declared, "These meetings became so authentic that I trembled with emotion and reverence as I participated in them." In the chapter on creative imagination, in Think and Grow Rich, Hill describes in vivid detail how he would construct this experience. He chose the mental setting, visualized each member, listened to their voices, and asked questions. Over time, he began to sense that the answers no longer came from his conscious mind, but from a deeper source. In his words, with time these characters not only answered wisely, but began to act on their own initiative. He said it felt as if he had awakened a connection to a collective intelligence, an ancestral consciousness, something that surpassed logic and manifested as pure inspiration. Was Hill creating an inner theater? Or was he truly accessing a spiritual field where brilliant minds remained active on another plane? To grasp the magnitude of this, we must let go of the notion that Hill was merely playing with imagination. What he practiced was in fact an advanced form of creative visualization, deeply rooted in esoteric traditions. The act of forming an inner circle of invisible advisors has existed for millennia, in Egyptian mysteries, Pythagorean schools, shamanic traditions, hermetic teachings, and in the active imagination exercises described by Carl Jung. These living archetypes are more than symbols. They are energies, powerful mental models with which the unconscious can engage. Hill was, perhaps unknowingly, reviving an ancient initiatory practice, and it didn't stop there. Hill reported that these meetings began to produce tangible results. Ideas emerged from nowhere, tough decisions became obvious after these sessions, and solutions appeared during sleep as if whispered by unseen voices. He credited part of his success and clarity to the guidance received from these spiritual mentors. In a particularly bold statement, he wrote, "These counselors were not mere fantasies. They were internal realities manifested as pure thought." Here, he crossed the line between the psychological and the mystical. He wasn't just training his creativity, he was cultivating a channel with infinite intelligence through the forms of the great men he admired. What Hill teaches us through this is that we are not limited by our biography, our time, or our external resources. The mind, when trained, can access what he called the universal bank of knowledge and tune into invisible mentors who, though not physically real, act as powerful forces within us. And this is perhaps one of the most transformative ideas of his legacy. Reality responds to disciplined imagination with the same force it responds to physical action. When we visualize with faith, with purpose, with genuine emotion, we awaken a field of possibility that transcends logic. This Council of Immortals is a living metaphor for what each of us can build, an inner gathering of our highest values, a mental space where we are not victims of the world, but co-authors of our destiny. Hill didn't speak of this as poetic allegory. He lived it. And perhaps this is the key that unites all his hidden teachings, the certainty that there is a universe within us, populated by ideas, images, and voices that carry the creative power of life. The mind is not a prison. To Hill, the mind was a temple, and the immortals he invoked weren't outside, they were within, in the part of us that never dies, in the part that already knows, in the part that waits only to be heard. Napoleon Hill spent most of his life teaching how to achieve success through the power of the mind, but there was something that deeply unsettled him, a silent presence, a subtle force that, even in the brightest minds, operated like an invisible saboteur. He called it drift, or in plain terms, mental drifting. This concept was fully revealed only in a bold manuscript hidden for over 70 years, Outwitting the Devil. Written in 1938, right after Think and Grow Rich, the book wasn't published until 2011 due to its controversial tone. In it, Hill conducts a fictional, yet hauntingly real, interview with the devil himself, personified as a universal consciousness ruling over fear, ignorance, and human distraction. This isn't a being with horns and a pitchfork. It's a mental pattern, a psychological virus, a symbolic entity that lives within each of us. The devil Hill describes is subtle, sophisticated, even charming. He says, "I dwell in the negative thoughts of men. I live wherever fear, doubt, procrastination, and conformity exist." And he adds, "My greatest weapon is the habit of drifting. When a person stops thinking for themselves and begins reacting automatically to external influences." This idea of drifting is central. According to Hill, the greatest enemy of success isn't failure, it's distraction, the absence of a definite purpose, the disguised conformity of routine. A drifter is someone who never questions, who lives on autopilot, who survives instead of truly living. And in Hill's eyes, that's exactly where the devil takes hold. An idle mind, as the saying goes, is the devil's workshop. And Hill wholeheartedly agreed. The dialogue between Hill and this symbolic entity is filled with unsettling revelations. The devil claims to control 98% of the world's population, and he does so through silent weapons. Fear of criticism, fear of poverty, fear of old age, fear of losing love, fear of illness, and fear of death. These are the 6 great fears that keep humanity imprisoned. Hill then isn't merely describing an external villain. He is exposing with brutal clarity the internal mechanisms that sabotage our greatness. He reveals that the human mind is a battlefield, and every unconscious thought feeds one side of that war. But how do we escape the grip of this inner devil? Hill is clear. Self-discipline and a definite purpose are the keys. When a person sets a higher purpose, a clear mission, something worth fighting and growing for, the devil loses control. Personal discipline, waking up with intention, acting with consistency, thinking independently, transforms an individual into someone immune to invisible manipulation. Hill writes, "The man who thinks clearly, acts boldly, and lives with purpose cannot be controlled by me. He has become master of his own mind." And here we find more than a lesson in success. We find a philosophy of inner liberation. There is a striking moment in the book when the devil confesses, "Independent thought is my greatest enemy." That statement should echo deeply in anyone seeking not just stability, but transformation. The simple act of pausing and reflecting, of questioning the automatic flow of life, is already a blow against inner darkness. Hill invites us to examine our habits, our routines, our inherited beliefs. How many of them were consciously chosen? How many are mere repetitions? What if we're living not as authors, but as characters in someone else's script? By personifying the devil as a psychological force, not a religious figure, Hill offers a powerful tool: the awareness of our own mind as a spiritual battleground. This is not about religion, it's about awakening, about understanding that within each of us there's a hidden saboteur, a whispering voice of doubt, fear, and excuses, and we only defeat this entity when we take command of our lives with clarity, courage, and action. Hill's devil is, in truth, the dark mirror of our own unconsciousness. It is the sum of our fears, unresolved traumas, mental laziness, and refusal to take responsibility. And defeating it takes more than techniques. It demands inner transformation. It demands that we awaken from the collective trance of mediocrity and choose day after day to be masters of our minds, authors of our destiny. Because in the end, as he so clearly states, you can't master the outer world while you're a slave to your inner world. If there is one concept that runs through Napoleon Hill's entire body of work like an invisible electric current, it is faith. But not blind, mystical, or religious faith in its dogmatic form. Hill speaks of faith as an active, real, almost scientific force, an invisible substance that gives shape, weight, and direction to human thought. In his most famous words, faith is the eternal elixir which gives life, power, and action to the impulse of thought. And from that statement we understand that for Hill, thought is energy, faith is fuel, and together they form the lever that moves the universe. In the chapter on faith in Think and Grow Rich, Hill makes a bold statement. Faith is a state of mind which may be induced by affirmation or repeated instructions to the subconscious mind. At first glance, this might seem like a simple lesson in mantras or motivational phrases, but it reveals something far deeper. Hill was anticipating ideas now validated by neuroscience and psychology, brain plasticity, the power of language over the unconscious, and our ability to reprogram how our brain responds to the world. When Hill speaks of faith as an induced state, he's showing us that it's not something you either have or don't have. It's something you build. It's like a muscle. It's training. It's a choice. But Hill's boldness goes further. In several parts of his work, he refers to the ether, the universe, as an energetic field, and thought as a vibrational impulse. He writes, "The ether, which permeates all things, is a medium that transmits thought vibrations just as it transmits sound and light waves." For the scientific standards of the 1930s, this was visionary, and today it resonates with ideas from quantum physics, morphic resonance, and morphogenetic fields studied by researchers like Rupert Sheldrake. Hill believed with conviction that the human mind not only emitted vibrations, but also tuned in to other minds, to ideas, and even to future solutions not yet realized. It was as if faith acted like an antenna, receiving answers that already exist, but only revealing themselves to those who truly believe. And that explains why, throughout his philosophy, faith appears not as a separate principle, but as the silent engine behind all the others. Without faith, desire lacks strength. Without faith, the plan doesn't hold. Without faith, persistence crumbles. Without faith, the mind cannot align with infinite intelligence. Hill understood that what transforms an ordinary thought into tangible reality is the emotional energy infused into it. And the most powerful emotion, according to him, was faith, the unshakable conviction that something is possible, not because it has happened yet, but because within you, it's already done. Throughout his life, Hill studied hundreds of success stories, and one pattern emerged among all the men and women who turned dreams into reality. They believed before they saw. There was no external evidence in the beginning, only a clear idea and a burning faith. He tells how Henry Ford believed so firmly in his vision of the V8 engine, even when his engineers said it was impossible, that he insisted they keep trying until they succeeded. Thomas Edison, after thousands of failed attempts, maintained the faith that he would invent the electric light. Andrew Carnegie once said, "Faith is the bridge between the invisible and the tangible. Without it, the human mind remains imprisoned by what already is." Hill saw this pattern repeat so many times that he concluded, faith is not merely a feeling, it is a mental technology. And this technology, according to Hill, is accessible to anyone. He teaches the method. Feed the mind with positive affirmations, visualize the desired result with emotion, act with purpose, and silence doubts through constant repetition of strengthening ideas. He said the subconscious mind doesn't distinguish truth from falsehood. It responds to repetition and emotion. Therefore, if you repeat what you desire with intensity and true belief, you will begin to shape not just your attitude, but the world around you. This is not superstition. This is the beginning of a vibrational mental reprogramming. Napoleon Hill also saw faith as a form of communication, not just with oneself, but with the universe itself. He believed that sincere faith, the kind that comes from inner silence and certainty without proof, was a spiritual language, a kind of magnetic request, a pulse that emerges from within you and aligns events, people, circumstances, and opportunities. That's why he said, the universe does not respond to what you want, it responds to what you are. And what you are is shaped by what you believe. That is why faith is the link between being and having, between thinking and achieving. At this point, the science of faith, as Hill proposed, is not something to be debated in theory. It is something to be experienced. When you put faith into motion, something shifts. Your posture changes, your language changes, your vibration changes. And the world, slowly, begins to respond, not because the universe was convinced, but because you were. And when you change on the inside, the world must align. That is the law. That is the science. That is the secret energy of thought. Amid all the formulas, steps, affirmations, and mental practices Napoleon Hill presents, there is one practice he doesn't proclaim loudly, yet it quietly runs through his entire philosophy. Silence. Not the silence of inertia, omission, or ignorance, but whose intentional silence. Not the absence of sound, but the deep presence of oneself. Hill understood perhaps better than any other thinker of his time that true success is not born from external noise, but from inner communion. That there is no wisdom without listening, and that the greatest of all secrets is hidden, where no one looks, in the silence between thoughts. He writes almost mystically in Think and Grow Rich. Ideas are living forces that arise in silence and move toward those who are ready to receive them. The idea that silence is a portal, a bridge to infinite intelligence, may sound abstract, but to Hill it was absolutely real. He believed that mental noise blocks the flow of inspiration. that a busy, anxious and noisy mind is incapable of capturing the most subtle signals of higher wisdom. And for that reason, he recommended, between the lines, the daily cultivation of moments of silent contemplation, of purposeful solitude, where the mind does not fight to find answers, but learns to receive them. Behind the scenes of his method's creation, Hill would spend long periods in solitary retreats, where he would write, meditate, reflect, and visualize. He called this introspection time. This introspection was, for him, the most productive time of all, not because he was physically producing, but because he was fine-tuning his internal alignment with what he called infinite intelligence. In other words, he would quiet the outer world in order to hear the inner one. And it was in these silent states, he said, that his best insights were born, that his greatest dilemmas were resolved, and that he felt, most clearly, that he was not alone. In his work, You Can Work Your Own Miracles, Hill dives even deeper into this mystery. He writes, "The most extraordinary miracles of the mind occur when the conscious mind quiets and gives way to the inner spiritual power." He was describing, in other words, what we now know as the alpha or even theta state, brainwaves associated with deep meditation, creativity, intuition, and insight. Without the modern labels of neuroscience, Hill already intuited that silence was a gateway to a higher state of being, more connected, more inspired, more creative. And here lies the most surprising detail. Hill did not teach this practice as a formalized method, perhaps because he knew that true silence cannot be imposed. It must be earned. It's not just about stopping speech or turning off external stimuli. It's about shutting down the internal noise, self-criticism, urgency, fear, judgment. True silence begins when we stop wrestling with our own thoughts and finally begin to listen to what lies behind them. And when that happens, something awakens, something reveals itself. A gentle voice, almost imperceptible, begins to guide, and that voice, Hill said, is not the mind. It is the voice of infinite intelligence whispering the way. He invites us to cultivate this sacred space daily, not to start the day in a rush, to create silent rituals of presence before decisions, in moments of crisis, during goal setting, to sit quietly for a few minutes with eyes closed and simply listen, not to the world, but to yourself, and to something greater than yourself. It's no coincidence that the greatest spiritual leaders, the greatest creative geniuses, the most visionary minds in history all shared this same habit of meditation, prayer, contemplation. They all understood that this inspiration lives in emptiness, and emptiness is born of silence. Napoleon Hill never called this practice meditation, a term not widely accepted in his era, but he lived it, subtly taught it, and considered it just as essential as any other law of success, because he knew without silence there is no intuition. Without intuition, there is no connection. And without connection, everything else is just effort without direction. Intentional silence is the compass that points to the soul's invisible north. And perhaps of all that he wrote and taught, this is the simplest and the most overlooked secret, because it requires something few are willing to give: time, surrender, listening, and humility. But for those who dare to quiet the outer world, the inner universe begins to speak. And when it speaks, with clarity, power, and love, all doubt dissolves. Because, as Hill once said, when the mind is at peace, the right answer appears. Always. What would make a man who spent over 20 years interviewing the greatest minds in history, industrialists, inventors, presidents, millionaires, and thinkers, choose to not reveal everything he discovered? That's the question that echoes silently between the lines of Napoleon Hill's life and work. Why, after assembling such a powerful philosophy of success, did he openly admit that he withheld part of the truth? What did he see? What did he experience that made him keep certain teachings to himself or to a very restricted circle of disciples? The answer is as unsettling as it is liberating. Not everyone is ready to hear the truth. And some truths, when revealed at the wrong time, do not enlighten, they blind. In various private interviews and little-known letters, Hill mentions that he was advised to tone down his words, to adapt certain parts of his philosophy to make them acceptable to the public of his time. The reasons were as varied as they were revealing: pressure from publishers, fear of critical rejection, censorship from religious institutions, and even the risk of losing his credibility among America's economic elite. We're talking about an era marked by extreme conservatism, the overwhelming influence of traditional religion on public opinion, and intolerance toward anything that sounded occult, esoteric, or heretical. Hill knew that the power he was studying and documenting was real, but he also knew it was dangerous to the structures that controlled the collective mind. He once wrote, "Truth is always simple, but never safe." In Outwitting the Devil, Hill addresses this more clearly, using the symbolic figure of the devil to represent all the forces of the system that keep the human being trapped in ignorance, fear, and blind obedience. The devil is not just an entity. It is the manipulative media, the mechanical education system, the religion that teaches guilt instead of love, the parents who suppress curiosity, the corporations that promote conformity. It is the sum of voices that teach us not to think, not to feel, not to question. Hill wanted to expose all of this, but he was silenced, out of fear, out of prudence, out of strategy, and out of understanding that sometimes the truth must be revealed in layers. So he coded, he concealed, he disguised, he used metaphors, symbolism, and ambiguous phrases. He introduced ideas like infinite intelligence, thought vibration, universal ether, and faith as creative energy, without ever explaining them directly, because he knew that those who were ready would understand, and those who weren't would just see pretty words. In one of his personal notes, Hill wrote, "The most dangerous knowledge is the one that reaches an unprepared mind. It can be poison instead of light." He believed that a kind of inner initiation was needed to absorb certain truths, and that his role was not to force revelations, but to plant seeds. There is also a more personal side. Hill faced bankruptcies, betrayals, attempts to discredit him, political and religious persecution. He knew that by touching on the invisible, the spiritual, the mystical, the metaphysical, he was stepping into a war not only of ideas, but of invisible forces. That's why he kept certain practices, experiences, and revelations only for his most advanced students. It was common, according to people close to him, for Hill to speak about topics like reincarnation, idea channeling, communication with higher intelligences, and energy manipulation, but always in closed circles, like someone sharing a flame that could either enlighten or burn. Another important point: Hill understood that the true secret cannot be taught like mathematics or logic. He said that some truths can only be recognized because they already live inside us. What he created was a path of discovery, an initiatory journey disguised as a self-help book. Each chapter, each story, each concept is like a mirror where the reader sees themselves, gets lost, and, if they have the courage, finds themselves again. Hill, in that sense, was more than a writer. He was an architect of consciousness, a messenger of something he perhaps didn't even fully comprehend with the mind, but that he intuited with the soul. And perhaps that is why he left so much in silence, because language has limits, because the true power lies beyond words, because the superficial reader looks for formulas, but the true seeker feels the hidden calling between the lines. Hill knew the deepest secret is not on the page, it's in the way you read it. in what you notice when everything goes quiet, in what you feel when you close the book and, for the first time, hear your own inner voice. That was the price he paid. To hide in order to protect, to remain silent in order to preserve, to disguise in order to perpetuate. And in doing so, he spread across the world a knowledge that, although never fully written, is entirely there for those who know how to see. Up to this point, you've explored the backstage of a philosophy that isn't confined to the pages of a book. It pulses like a living force behind every line written by Napoleon Hill. You've uncovered the hidden secrets, the unspoken laws, the invisible masters, the dialogues with fear, the science of faith, the power of silence. But none of that matters, absolutely nothing, if you don't know how to apply it in real life. Hill never intended for his teachings to be merely read. He wanted them to be lived. Because true knowledge is not what fills the mind with ideas, it's what turns the soul into action. And this is where most people miss the point when reading Think and Grow Rich. The secret only works for those who complete the missing step. And what is that step? It's the step of daily connection with infinite intelligence. Not as a concept, but as a practice. Hill teaches us that thoughts are vibrations, that faith is a frequency field, that the ether transmits intentions like antennas. But what makes the system work is not just knowing, it's continuous presence, disciplined repetition, commitment to a vibrational mental state. In other words, you must become a constant transmitter of thought charged with purpose, emotion, and faith. That is the real secret. It's not knowing what to do, it's living as if you already are. Because the universe doesn't respond to what you occasionally think. It responds to what you consistently emanate. Hill made it clear that there is a ritual for constructing reality that must be followed faithfully. And this ritual is made up of 4 fundamental practices. 1. Emotional repetition of goals. Every day, upon waking and before sleeping, affirm your desires clearly, as if they were already real, not with cold words, but with vivid emotion. Feel what it would be like to have achieved it. See it, touch it, give thanks. Do it until your body reacts as if it's already true, because for the subconscious, there's no difference. 2. Intentional silence and inner listening. Set aside minutes each day to quiet everything. Listen to what is not being said. Observe what pulses behind your logical mind. This is the space where ideas arrive, where answers are born, where connection happens. Hill practiced this religiously. He didn't call it meditation, but that's exactly what it was, a silent spiritual practice of alignment with the invisible. 3. Action aligned with faith. No thought manifests without movement. True faith demands action, but not just any action. Action with intention, courage, rhythm, and persistence. Hill said, "Faith moves mountains, but it's the shovel in your hands that digs." Every thought charged with faith must be sealed with a concrete step, even a small one, toward your vision. 4. Constant consultation with the source. Hill spoke daily with his invisible counsel, as we've seen. You can do the same. Create a symbolic space in your mind where you speak with future versions of yourself, with real or imagined mentors, with archetypes of wisdom. This isn't madness, it's training intuition, creativity, and decision-making. And it works, because you're accessing higher parts of your own consciousness. By applying these practices day by day, you stop operating as an ordinary human and begin acting as a conscious creator of reality. And this isn't spiritual arrogance, it's the natural destiny of the awakened. Hill said, "The real secret can only be activated by those who live in tune with it." That's why so many read the book and nothing changes, because they read it like a novel, when they should read it as a call to transform. The great truth is that Hill's philosophy is not a manual for making money. It's a system for reprogramming the mind, aligning the soul, moving the invisible, and transforming the visible. It's a spiritual formula disguised as practical strategy. And the part he didn't write, he hoped you would discover on your own. The missing step is this: to create a daily ritual of vibrational alignment with your purpose. Today, it doesn't matter if you call it faith, prayer, visualization, or a conversation with the universe. The name doesn't matter. What matters is consistency, surrender, belief, and motion. Because in the end, as Hill himself said, the only real limitation of the human being lies within their own mind. What you believe, you create. You have walked through the visible and invisible pages of Napoleon Hill's legacy. You've discovered that behind Think and Grow Rich, there is not just a manual of goals or a motivational script, but a secret map of the human soul. A compendium of spiritual wisdom that was, in part, silenced out of prudence, and in part, deliberately hidden for those who were ready to hear the voice that cannot be written, only felt. That voice is yours. Hill spent his life saying there is a power, a force, an invisible intelligence that responds to burning desire, unwavering faith, disciplined thought, and directed emotion. But above all, it responds to something even more subtle, the call of your essence. And that is why the secret was never written, because it cannot be given, it can only be awakened. It is present in every decision you make when no one is watching, in every silent thought you choose to nourish, in every intuitive feeling that nudges you toward the right path. The secret is in the spaces between the lines of your own life. Hill said, "Whatever the mind of man can conceive and believe, it can achieve." But the real power of that phrase isn't in the words, it's in the moment, when you believe before you see, when you feel before you touch, when you act before you are sure. That is when the universe begins to respond, because you stepped out of theory and into creation. All of Hill's invisible masters, all the laws he taught, all the secrets he suggested, they all converge on one truth. You are the key. Your vibrational state, your emotional discipline, your connection to silence, your courage to think independently, these shape what you attract, what you build, and what you live. The world doesn't change when you learn something new. The world changes when you become the kind of person who lives by that new knowing. The secret, then, is not a mystery to be solved. It is a version of you that already exists, waiting to be awakened. Napoleon Hill didn't write everything, not because he ran out of time, but because he knew that the final page of the book would be written by you. In how you choose to act tomorrow, in how you care for your mind today, in how you decide right now to stop being a prisoner of the outer world and begin mastering your inner one. Because everything you need is already there within you, and it always was. What was missing was not the knowledge. It was realizing that it had always been speaking to you, in silence. And now, only one question remains. Are you ready to listen to the voice within you? The one Napoleon Hill tried to awaken, not with catchphrases, but with truths whispered to your soul. Because the secret he didn't write, he left in every heartbeat that dares to believe. And that secret is you.